Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's live Masculinity and the War of 1812 talk. This is the first night of 3 that we will be hosting here online. Tonight we have Jake Breadman, who will be doing our first talk, and his talk is called "The Father to His Children Will Make Known the Mournful Story. Marital masculinity in the life of memory of the Major General Sir Isaac Brock in Upper Canada." So before I hand it over to Jake, I'm going to read our land acknowledgement. The Niagara region of Ontario is located on the traditional shared territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Chinootan peoples. The Chinootan peoples have called these lands home for thousands of years, and more recently, the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee have been sharing the lands as one dish, one spoon treaty territory. So with no further ado, I'll hand it over to Jake and enjoy the talks. Please stick around after, as Jake will be answering some questions. So there's a chat on Facebook. If you're streaming in, you can write in the comments below, or here on Zoom. Please write your questions in the chat. I'll be monitoring them throughout and writing them down. And hopefully we can ask Jake at the end and we can have a little bit of a conversation. All right, enjoy the talk.
Hi, everyone. All right, so right now, well, first of all, I got to say big shout out to my friend Caitlin Carter, she's going to be presenting her talk next week, but she's going to be managing my slides tonight, which I really appreciate. So thanks for that, Caitlin. Okay, but before we begin, I would like to give a very warm thank you to the Niagara Falls Museum for organizing and hosting this event. I'm currently coming at you live from downtown Kingston, Ontario, so there shouldn't be any crazy noise, but if there is, just, I apologize in advance. Okay, anyways, let's jump right into the presentation. So Caitlin, if you could please go to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so this presentation explores the complexities of gender, military masculinity, especially in Upper Canada, which is present-day Ontario. And I do this by specifically analyzing Brock's life and the ways that he was remembered by Upper Canadians after his death. And I basically sort of conclude that in life, Brock adhered to gendered norms of the early 1800s, sort of an average guy in that sense. But in death, he sort of became this hyper-masculine hero around which historians at least began to form a shared Upper Canadian identity. Now, the one thing we should know before going any further is this presentation is divided into 3 sections that I'm going to cover to sort of just to note Brock's adherence to masculine norms of the early 19th century and also his heroization by later writers. So the first section, or the first source that I look at, are Proclamations, which I sort of reinforce Brock's masculinity as he framed himself as this benevolent, strong defender of Upper Canadian freedom, especially compared to the feeble American Brigadier General Hull. The second set of sources that I look at are letters, which show how Brock used correspondence to maintain familial ties while abroad in Upper Canada and also exert paternal authority. These letters also display how Brock was and sort of later on became a paternal figure to those around him. And through the letters, we also see that social life afforded Brock an opportunity to strengthen his relationship with fellow brother officers, but also chivalrously entertain women in Upper Canadian society. And the third and final set of sources that I looked at for this project were post-war histories and biographies of Brock. And particularly through these sources, I looked at moderation as a manly trait for officers in Upper Canada, which, this sort of moderation could be exercised through the prevention and abstention from excessive violence and alcohol consumption in particular. Okay, next slide, please, Caitlin. Thank you. Okay, so you might be wondering how exactly I came to study this topic. Well, it really all begins in 2019 when I was working as a guide at Brock's Monument atop Queenston Heights. It's a really lovely site. If you've never seen it before, I'd highly recommend checking it out. But through this job, I became quite interested in the wide range of perceptions that visitors to the monument had of Brock. I basically sort of realized that there was Brock the man, who I knew, and then there was Brock the legend. And I wanted to sort of do what I could to separate the two, but also understand them together. Now, my interest in this topic also stems from reading gender histories of Upper Canada, especially this book here, Public Men and Virtuous Women by Cecilia Morgan. And in this book, Morgan notes that Upper Canadian leaders provided inhabitants of the colony, being Upper Canada, with, quote, symbols that embodied masculine decency under the duress of war and strife, the Christian soldier and his real life embodiment, Major General Brock, end quote. So this is an interesting passage, but Morgan doesn't really elaborate much further on this point. So I sort of took this thread and I sort of opted to show how exactly Brock embodied and was sort of made into the ideal masculine soldier for Upper Canadians to emulate. Next slide, please. Okay, so who was Major General Sir Isaac Brock? Now, most people from Niagara are typically at least somewhat familiar with them, whether it be through the university, Brock's monument, or just like a general knowledge of the War of 1812. But just before we go any further, here's the Cliff Notes version of his life. So Brock was an Englishman from a military family born on the island of Guernsey in the Channel Islands, which is the set of islands in between England and France. Brock was literate, well-read, wealthy, especially so in later life, tall and athletic. And he was also a senior officer, a very high-ranking senior officer in the British Army who anticipated war with America and made fairly extensive preparations for such an event. And although Brock had very little military experience prior to the onset of the War of 1812, he was really successful at the beginning of the war, particularly in taking Forts Michilimackinac and Detroit from the Americans. However, he died at the Battle of Queenston Heights, which was the first American invasion of Niagara, and he died performing a charge that probably should have been left to a more junior officer under his command. That's a short biography on Brock. Next slide, please, Caitlin. So what exactly is masculinity and how did it manifest in Brock's day? Now, I wish I had a simpler answer to this question, but the answer is really quite complex. But I'll try to make it at least understandable, hopefully. So what really makes an individual masculine or feminine is subjective, and it's really wholly decided on by individual people. So really, in short, masculinity or femininity is in the eyes of the beholder, right? And while everyone has their own definition of masculinity or femininity, there are certain gender norms that in some cases are more prominently adhered to. So some examples of some gender norms would be like men cutting the grass or paying for the bill on the first date, for example. Now, this isn't to say that women don't cut the grass or pay the bill on the first date, but that it's something that at least people of a certain generation might expect members of a certain gender would do or believe should be done. Now, anyone can realistically deviate from these gender norms, but doing so can sometimes affect a person socially. Now, in Brock's time, and especially amongst his upper class peers, there were also certain masculine norms to which people were expected to adhere. And some of these norms might be somewhat familiar to us in the present day and some less so. So what were some of these norms? Well, let's talk about them. So in wartime, especially, officers like Brock were supposed to be cool, calm, and collected, and they had to toe a very fine line between being cautious and being careless, because if they're too much of one or the other, their action or inaction could result in military failure. Now, it was also presumed that officers like Brock would abstain from excessive violence and drinking. And if officers were violent and engaged in a military challenge, like a duel, for example, they definitely had to conduct themselves honorably. Now, violent atrocities were typically considered to be the result of negative, excessive emotions like rage, and therefore could actually make an officer unmanly. And officers' disdain for excessive violence and this sort of preference for mercy actually stemmed from the popularity, or I should probably say revival, of chivalry in the early 1800s, a movement to which women were quite central. These chivalric officers were basically expected to entertain women with conversation and dancing, which were, again, two other ways an officer could assert their heterosexuality, which was, of course, another tenet vital to masculinity back then. Now, the general absence of women from the military actually, in some ways, threatened to emasculate men, because typically officers, unless they were very high ranking, typically couldn't get married. So officers were expected to develop alternative brotherly bonds, which were sustained through hobbies like hunting, for example. And officers like Brock were also trusted to be kind and gentle, sort of surrogate fathers to the enlisted men and junior officers under their command. And while many historians, or some gender historians, I should say, often perceive military life as sort of like this flight from home life, officers often maintained connections to home and were actually able to exert household authority through things like letter writing, especially writing letters back to family or sweethearts. So now that we have some of the masculine expectations of the early 19th century established, let's turn to Brock's own words to see how he adhered to gendered norms of his time. Next slide, please, Caitlin. Just gonna take a sip of water too. Okay, so this section here, we're gonna look at proclamations, particularly the one issued by Brigadier General William Hall, and then the counter proclamation issued by Brock. So what I really want to say with this section is that Brock's masculinity really can't be understood without contrasting it to his enemies, especially Brigadier General William Hall, who was the fellow that invaded Upper Canada in July 1812. And in Hall's proclamation to the inhabitants of Upper Canada, he sort of like flexes his metaphorical muscles and states that Britain's, quote, insults and indignities have once more left Americans no alternative but manly resistance or unconditional submission, end quote. This is interesting, but here we see Hall sort of reference the British threatening American independence, which was a large cause of the War of 1812, to sort of justify their invasion of Canada, because inaction meant unconditional submission. And this association sort of relegated American men to a position akin to their wives or slaves, in a sort of subservient position. Then Hall sort of later in the proclamation goes on to remind Upper Canadians of their familial bond to Americans. And he says, quote, raise not your hands against your brethren. Many of your fathers fought for the freedom and independence we now enjoy. Being children, therefore, of the same family with us and heirs to the same heritage, the arrival of an army of friends must be hailed by you with a cordial welcome, end quote. So again, interesting part of the proclamation here. Hall doesn't really ask Upper Canadians to serve alongside the Americans, but to simply welcome the American invasion, which he justified by invoking the familial heritage of many Upper Canadians, who indeed were actually largely American refugees or opportunists. Now, the gendered language of the above passages are clear. Britain really offered nothing to Upper Canadians but subservience, implying that Upper Canadian men were akin to women. But the status of Upper Canadians as men could be reaffirmed by supporting the American invasion. Next slide, please, Caitlin. Now, given the gendered connotation of Hall's proclamation, it's really not surprising that Brock responded with one equally steeped in the gendered language of the early 1800s. So Brock, again, not going to do the full thing or anything, but Brock sort of begins his proclamation by dismissing Hall's words as slanderous, and then he follows with, of course, a few good paragraphs on how great the British Empire is. Then Brock relates that during the 7 Years' War, the American colonies were, quote, wrested by the arms of Great Britain from no other motive than to relieve her ungrateful children from the oppression of a cruel neighbor, end quote. So in this passage, we see Brock undermining American nationhood using a familial metaphor, calling the Americans ungrateful children whose metaphorical father, being King George III, wanted only to protect them against the French. But instead, Brock casts the Americans as children and sort of refutes Hall's assertion of strong and manly American independence. And of course, while Hall promised Upper Canadian independence from British tyranny, Brock assures Upper Canadians that the Americans were hand in glove with the Bonapartist French, asking, quote, "Are you prepared, inhabitants of Upper Canada, to become willing subjects, or rather slaves, to the despot who rules the nations of Europe with a rod of iron? And do not give cause to your children, when groaning under the oppression of a foreign master, to reproach you with having too easily parted with the richest inheritance on earth, a participation in the name, character, and freedom of Britons." Again, it's quite a lofty proclamation, but here we see Brock encouraging Upper Canadians not just to think of their immediate families in need of protection against the combined forces of France and America, but their descendants too. Sort of by adhering to the British flag, according to Brock, Upper Canadians could assure their descendants British freedom and masculine independence. Now, Brock's counter proclamations resonated quite deeply amongst Upper Canadians. This is evinced by one poem published in the Kingston Gazette in September 1812, which is titled "The Bugbear Exterminator." And in this poem, the brave Brock is contrasted with the boastful Hall, whom Brock proved, quote, "an empty, crazy Hall," end quote. Now, this is an interesting choice of words because crazy actually had a gendered connotation in the 19th century because it was largely associated with women and could be contrasted with manly moderation and logic. So in this sort of poem by this anonymous Upper Canadian, we see Hall sort of being unmanned by the author because his emotions and actions were out of control and thus devoid of independence and rationality. So after the War of 1812, Brock was easily framed as the masculine ideal in Upper Canada, in part because of how enemy officers like Hall were characterized and criticized by post-war historians. And in an age where an Upper Canadian identity was being crafted, Brock served to differentiate Upper Canadians from Americans. And I sort of argue that this was the beginning of a Canadian exceptionalism that prided itself on its difference to Americans. Next slide, please, Caitlin. Now, while Brock was praised for his activeness, especially compared to Hall, his actions could also be considered rash. I mean, think of the charge at the Battle of Queenston Heights. Like I said earlier, that was something that a more junior officer probably should have done. Well, many commentators and many contemporaries of Brock realized this, and they carefully combated it in their writings on him. So one Niagara newspaper called The Bee realized that there were some critics that may have faulted Brock for his actions and stated, quote, "General Brock was bold and daring even to excess, utterly regardless of danger, his country's good, the honor of England, the fame of Britain was his leading star." Again, lofty words, but we see in this passage Brock's reckless charge at Queenston Heights is attributed to his patriotism, not carelessness, and was therefore made more justifiable. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's move on. We'll move on from proclamations, and now we'll talk about some of the letters that Brock sent to people. So Brock's letters grant some insight into the masculinity he adhered to and practiced during his life, especially when it comes to the maintenance of household authority from afar. So in one letter to his sister-in-law, for example, he wrote, quote, "I have no doubt that Maria and Zelia, who were Brock's nieces, continue to conduct themselves in such a manner as to reward you amply for the unbounded kindness you have all along shown them. If I am able in the fall to procure handsome skins for muffs worth their acceptance, I shall send some to the dear little girls. They ought, however, to write me. There are few here brought up with the advantages they have received. Indeed, the means for education are very limited for both sexes in this colony." Again, this is interesting. I love the little guilt trip at the end there. and at the end, we see Brock sort of, even from the Canadas, extending his paternal love to his nieces through the promise of presents. But again, he's also stepping in the role as that sort of authority, fatherly figure by encouraging his nieces to be more studious and write him more often. Next slide, please. Now, unsurprisingly, the absence of letters could also strain familial ties. So writing to his brothers, Brock expressed displeasure at not receiving any letters from James Brock, who was his nephew and a paymaster of the 49th Regiment, which was the same regiment that Brock belonged to. And about his nephew, Brock says, quote, "I seldom hear from James Brock, who dislikes writing to such a degree that he hazards the loss of a friend rather than submit to the trouble." Now, certain military families like the Brocks often chose to join certain regiments because of a familial connection to it, which is quite evident by James's employment in the 49th Regiment. So it's possible that Brock might have felt even more slighted by his nephew's ill attention, especially considering that James's employment in the 49th probably sprang from Brock's influence. So these two passages, both the letter to his brothers and the letter to his sister-in-law, really reinforce the importance of letter writing to military men, because not only did it allow them to maintain some sort of household authority and sort of maintain their masculinity, but it was also a nice way for them to stay in touch with their family, which of course everyone wants to do. Next slide, please. Now, exchanging letters with family was one way to exert paternal care, but masculinity could also be reinforced through paternal care to fellow members of the military. And one soldier in particular who experienced Brock's paternal care was Captain James Fitzgibbon, who's a name that we typically associate with the British victory at the Battle of Beaver Dams, but he's probably more well known actually because he was supposedly the officer that was warned by Laura Secord of the impending American advance at the Battle of Beaver Dams. But aside from that, Fitzgibbon was a really, really interesting guy. Of course, he joined the Army as a private and through merit eventually became a sergeant major, which is the highest rank that an enlisted man could serve before becoming an officer. And to become an officer in the British Army in the early 19th century, you typically would have had to buy your position, basically. And it was very expensive to buy your position. And therefore typically inaccessible to someone like Fitzgibbon, who came from a working class family. But Brock actually realized the potential in Fitzgibbon and purchased a commission for him in the army. And in Fitzgibbon's own memoirs, or sorry, not in Fitzgibbon's memoirs, but in the life of Fitzgibbon written by one of his descendants, she notes that Brock was basically like a father to Fitzgibbon and tried to do everything he could to educate him on how to become a gentleman and an officer. And therefore, it's really not surprising to me that Fitzgibbon wrote in 1824 that Brock, quote, "had been more than a father to me in that regiment, which he ruled like a father," end quote. Now, Brock's care for his brother officers and enlisted men undoubtedly would have propelled his status as this sort of like paternal figure amongst Britons and Upper Canadians. Indeed, Upper Canadians too did in fact perceive Brock paternally, and we see this through an excerpt in the York Gazette published in October 1812, which states, quote, "General Brock soon appeared in the midst of his faithful troops, whom he loved with the affection of a father." And then we also have an Upper Canadian poet in 1833 who referred to Brock as Canada's gallant patriarch. Next slide, please. Now, fatherly duties aside, officers like Brock were also expected to engage in Upper Canadian society by attending and hosting races, parties, and balls. And of course, women were vitally important at these social events because they were, as one historian puts it, quote, "a visible symbol of their husband's political rank and social status," end quote, which this is a privilege that Brock didn't really have, because he was actually unmarried for his entire life. Excuse me. But although Brock didn't have a partner, we know that he certainly paid attention to ladies' desires. His one friend, for example, wrote to him that, quote, "The ladies of this house always beg to be remembered by you with the sincerest good wishes for your health and happiness." So we know that Brock at least entertained ladies' company, as any good chivalric British officer should do. But how exactly did he perceive women? Well, Brock's letters do actually grant some insight to this question, especially his letters to his friend Edward Baines. Now, Brock and Upper Canadian society more generally was absolutely captivated by Juliana de Rottenberg, who was the wife of Major General Francis de Rottenberg, one of the major senior officers leading the War of 1812 in Upper Canada. And Juliana, according to Brock, made, quote, "a complete conquest of all hearts. She is, in reality, remarkably handsome, both in face and figure, and her manners uncommonly pleasing, graceful, and affable." And Baines's reply was even more generous than Brock's description. But the focus on Juliana's physical beauty by both men was this sort of like tacit assertion of their heterosexuality to one another, which in turn made them more masculine, as Georgian Britons considered homosexuality effeminate. Indeed, Baines, and likely Brock too, understood what it meant to not be a ladies' man. And Baines, for example, noted upon meeting the Duke of Manchester that, quote, "He does not appear to be a ladies' man, perhaps a little too much the contrary," end quote. Next slide, please, Caitlin. Now, Brock enjoyed other polite accomplishments beyond entertaining ladies, such as hunting, which, as I mentioned earlier, was really vital to reinforcing military masculinity and brotherly affection between officers. And while we know Brock did participate in polite society and entertained women, he seems to have preferred the company of his brother officers and noted, quote, "My situation obliges me to maintain some sort of establishment. Otherwise, I should, from inclination, confine my intercourse to a very limited circle." And I think Brock's preference for these brotherly hangouts is sort of further reinforced by the fact that at death, Brock was rather exceptionally 43 and unmarried. And I say exceptionally because many senior officers in the British Army typically had enough money where they would be able to have a wife and support a family, even if their wives were staying back home in Britain somewhere rather than following them to Upper Canada. But Brock, being a senior officer and really wealthy, he was sort of in this position to become a husband, but he never chose to do so, which makes him exceptional. Now, some post-war historians felt uncomfortable about Brock's bachelordom. John Richardson, for example, wrote in 1842 that, quote, "Although Brock never married, he was extremely devoted to female society." And I think we can sort of see the anxiety over Brock's solitude in this statement, right? It was suspect enough that Brock was 43 unmarried, so Richardson clearly felt it was necessary to quell fears over Brock's potential homosexuality, and thus suggested that he enjoyed ladies' companies. And later Victorian historians even felt it necessary, or sorry, not Victorian historians, later Edwardian historians felt it necessary to incorporate a lover into Brock's story, likely to make him seem more heterosexual and masculine. For example, in 1908, Walter Nursey was the fellow who started the myth that Brock was betrothed to Sophia Shaw, who was the daughter of militia officer Major General Aeneas Shaw. And the Shaw story, although really fascinating, it's false and unsubstantiated in any sources from the early 1800s. But it's interesting for a different reason to me, because while Brock's bachelordom may have been acceptable for military men of the early 19th century, it wasn't so acceptable for Victorian and Edwardian civilian audiences who clearly felt the need to heterosexualize him. So here we have a good example of the hero of Upper Canada being sort of remade to serve the masculine ideals of different generations. Next slide, please. Now, although Brock participated in dueling, which was a practice that some considered excessively violent, his involvement in dueling was actually justified by his relative and biographer, Ferdinand Brock Tupper. But again, before we go any further, it is worth noting that dueling did actually have contested meanings in the early and mid-19th century, at least from a gender perspective. There were those who supported dueling and argued that it was a well-moderated, ritualistic form of violence. Think about Hamilton and the 10 Duel Commandments, right? It's a very moderated form of violence. But there were some critics, however, who thought, or they decried dueling for its lack of emotional restraint. But despite all this, Brock, according to his biographer Tupper, engaged in a duel shortly after joining the 49th Regiment, which I will read to you now. So it goes, quote, "When Captain Brock joined the 49th Regiment, the peace of the regiment was disturbed by one of those vile pests of society, a confirmed duelist. Captain Brock soon proved to his brother captain, who took the advantage of being a dead shot, that he was neither to be bullied nor intimidated, and the consequence was a challenge from the latter, which was promptly accepted. On the ground, Captain Brock, who was very tall and athletic, observed that to stand at 12 paces was not to meet his antagonist on anything like equal terms, and, producing a handkerchief, insisted on firing across it. This the duelist positively declined, and being in consequence soon after compelled to leave the regiment." Again, very interesting passage here, or entertaining, I should say. But Tupper's motive, I think, with this passage was to demonstrate Brock's honor, right? By calling his opponent a confirmed duelist, he implied that the challenger was simply looking for a fight, which rendered his cause unjust and dishonorable. Of course, though, Tupper bolsters his uncle's courage on the other hand by stating that Brock promptly accepted the challenge nonetheless, follows all the necessary conduct of a duel, but using his cunning ration and logic was able to defuse the situation and dishonor his opponent. So quite simply, Brock was sort of manly enough to accept the challenge from the duelist, but emotionally moderate enough to diffuse the situation. Next slide, please. Now, officers like Brock were also expected to prevent Indigenous warriors from conducting what they considered an excessively violent form of warfare. But it's worth noting that violence is subjective. Scalping, for example, was just as important to Indigenous warfare as linear tactics was to European, or at least just as much part of the culture, right? But despite this, Anglo-Americans believed that Indigenous people needed to be controlled and prevented from committing excessive violence. So it's really unsurprising that Brock spoke of Indigenous warriors positively for their, quote, order and steadiness, and noted after Detroit that, quote, "A few prisoners were taken by them during the advance, whom they treated with every humanity." So from this sort of small passage here, we see that Brock clearly valued Indigenous warriors when they were restrained and prevented from committing what officers like Brock perceived as excessive violence. In this sense, Indigenous people were viewed somewhat similarly to women and children who were supposedly desperately in need of white patriarchal influence and control. Now, it's worth noting, though, that Brock could have never truly fully controlled Indigenous warriors because, as many historians like Carl Benn, for example, show, Indigenous warriors followed their own leaders, not British or American officers. But in history and memory, Brock was sort of remade as this paternal figure that did, in fact, control Indigenous warriors. So shortly after Brock's death, for example, the Reverend William Smart of Brocktown claimed that Brock saved Americans from Indigenous warriors on the frontiers, particularly in the Old Northwest, which was the land between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. So Brock was sort of perceived as this man who could control Indigenous people and the one who sort of saved white Americans from excessive violence on the frontiers, but this was really quite far from the truth, because violence was committed by both Indigenous people and American settlers throughout the Old Northwest before, during, and long after the War of 1812. And if you want to know more about this topic, I would highly suggest reading Illinois and the War of 1812 by Gillum Ferguson. Now, the myth of Brock's control over Indigenous people was further propelled by historians after the war ended. For example, one anonymous poet who simply went by an Acadian in 1815 wrote that Indigenous warriors looked to Brock for paternal aid, and that he, being Brock, quote, restrained their rage, to him they bend, and onward for the fort, being Fort Detroit, in silence wend. And of course, Brock was made even more manly by his supposed ability to exert his authority over Indigenous people that were, as the poet says, incensed with ire. Because the more frightful and ferocious the Indigenous warriors looked, the more manly Brock was perceived by his supposed ability to control them. So by the mid-19th century, Indigenous people were perceived by colonial society as sort of childlike passive players in Upper Canadian society. And Brock was at the heart of this myth. He was the masculine hero that all Upper Canadians aspired to be, the man who controlled and saved Indigenous people from themselves. And colonists that wanted to be manly like Brock, who was their hero, had to similarly save Indigenous people. And this rhetoric, which is deeply steeped in Victorian paternalism, ultimately culminated in genocide, as we know. It also reinforced a shared Upper Canadian identity that contrasted the civilized Brock and his Upper Canadians with supposedly savage Indigenous people. Next slide, please, Caitlin. Now, British officers were not only expected to abstain from and restrain excessive violence, but they were also expected to restrain from excessive drinking as well. But interestingly, excessive drinking was actually tolerated so long as it didn't affect an officer's daily work. But the interesting thing about Brock, he was sort of supposedly sober towards the end of his life. In one letter to his brother, he noted, quote, "At present, I live very abstemiously and scarcely ever touch wine." Now, Brock may have lived soberly because he knew the consequences of heavy drinking through his own regiment, the 49th, which, according to him, quote, "has been 10 years in this country drinking rum without bounds, but it is still respectable," end quote. So this passage that I just read here implies that Brock held excessive drinking with contempt, as he needed to specify that the 49th Regiment was still respectable despite their intemperance. Now, considering Brock's supposed sobriety compared to other officers and the association that he made between excessive drinking and immorality, what exactly do we make of the large amount of alcohol left in his estate after his death? It's a lot, trust me. Well, for one, I think it can be said that Brock wasn't a teetotaler, as he suggested. It's possible that it's possible that Brock's brother disapproved of the prevalent drinking culture of the British Army, and so Brock himself sought to diminish his drinking. It's also possible that Tupper, Brock's biographer, may have actually excluded letters that reference Brock's drinking, preferring only to include those that emphasize his sobriety. And I think that these exclusions are especially likely given the popularity of the temperance movement in the mid-19th century English-speaking world. Next slide, please. Okay, so the main title of this presentation actually comes from a Montreal newspaper, which invokes a familial scene and declares, quote, "The father to his children will make known the mournful story of Brock's death." And this quote, I think, is a fitting title given the domestic scene and its relation to Brock on one hand, but also because it emphasizes the role that ordinary Upper Canadians had in the creation of Brock the Legend. And the masculinity that Brock adhered to throughout his life, of course, made him an easy candidate for heroization by these Upper Canadians, who tried to make him out to be this faultless paragon of manliness in the years after his death. And Brock, as we know, was characterized as fatherly, chivalrous, gentle, rational, and sober. And although Upper Canada was thoroughly diverse in the early and mid-19th century, a distinct identity was being formed, one that prided itself on its difference to Americans. And Brock was sort of made to be the masculine antithesis to the supposed irrational, rabble-rousing republic to the south. Now, Brock will continue to be interpreted in vastly different ways in the future, and that's not new. To me, it's not frightening either, because history, like masculinity, is constantly changing. So we can really only speculate how future generations will interpret Brock, but I'm certain that masculinity and its ever-changing nature will always transform to encompass Brock into its fold. Next slide, please. Okay, well, that's all for me. Thanks everyone for listening so attentively to my presentation. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to present it. I guess we'll move on to some questions now, if that's okay.
Perfect. I will just get the, all right, well, I have some questions here. That was a great talk. Thank you for that, Jake. So first and foremost, I guess you've been working on this for the past couple years, and I'm wondering how was the major part of your research conducted during the height of COVID, and how did you find this affected your ability to answer your thesis and what you were trying to ask and answer?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, because I started this in 2019 when COVID didn't exist. And by the end of the winter semester at Brock, when I should have started writing this paper, COVID had basically hit full force and all the archives were closed. So basically I was forced to only really use sources that were available digitally to me. So I really benefited on one hand from Brock's letters as they were published in Tupper, which if you haven't read them, I would really suggest reading them, because they really give some interesting insight into Brock and his life in Upper Canada. So yeah, I heavily relied on Tupper's letters, and also this one search engine, which I would highly recommend to anyone studying Canadian history. It's called Canadiana Online, which is a sort of like database of digitized primary sources, mainly books. And the one thing that I really liked about Canadiana is that you could actually easily search through books using Control F for any references on Brock. So on the one hand, it was challenging because I could only use a selection of sources, and I couldn't actually use any sources on Brock that may have actually been in archives. I was only using online stuff. So on the one hand, that kind of sucked, but also it was nice having the digital sources because they're so easy to navigate and find the information that you need.
Yes, Control F is a great feature.
Yeah.
So as you know, currently here at the museum, we have a temporary exhibition that was curated in-house called The Women's Work is Never Done, and then obviously our War of 1812 gallery. And so I'm wondering, how does your paper relate to our temporary or permanent galleries in terms of topic and connections?
Yeah. So I have an answer to this. It sort of relates somewhat separately to both galleries. It does relate to both galleries, actually, now that I'm thinking of it. But I think it's worth noting that women were absolutely vital to the operation of the British Army and the American Army too during the War of 1812, whether they were working as nurses in field hospitals, scullery maids, or civilian women working on the farms and producing agricultural yields while husbands served in the militia, right? I mean, the army basically needed women in order for it to operate successfully. And that's something that I think is often left out in many histories of the War of 1812. But the one thing as well that I didn't really talk too much about in this presentation is that gender history really can't be understood without understanding of power relations. And masculinity and all the related values that Brock exuded ultimately serve to preserve men's position at the top of the gender hierarchy. Like take chivalry, for example. Although it seems noble from a surface level, it ultimately places women in a subservient position to men, because women are perceived as this sort of like weaker sex in need of male saviors, right? There's a reason why many of the early upper class suffragettes campaigned against notions of chivalry and things like that. So yeah, I think that's one thing. You really can't study masculinity history. You have to study gender history, and gender history has to be all encompassing, and it has to include women in it, which is something that a lot of the gender historians talk about in their work, and which I wasn't able to do as much today, but if you could read my full paper, you'll see it's there.
Okay. On that note, is there somewhere that your paper is accessible for people to read?
Yeah, I'll write my name down in the chat if anyone's interested in reading it. It's quite long. It was actually one of the difficult things is like turning a 50-page paper into a like 35-40-minute talk. It's actually a really tough thing to do. So I had to exclude a lot of stuff, and the information and the evidence that I provide today is really just a very small fraction of all the evidence that I have for these points in the paper. But what I'll do is I'll write my email in the chat here, and if anyone wants to read the full paper, you can just send me an email at jakebreadman@gmail.com, and I'll happily send you the paper.
Great, that's good. And just so you know, if anyone wants to see the exhibition Women's Work is Never Done, it is on until the end of the year before we switch over to our new exhibition that's coming in. So I think we have time for one or two more questions. Do you think any of the masculine ideas that Brock adhered to or exhibited during his life exist in present day? If any, which are the most prevalent today?
Yeah, I see Jesse asked the exact same question. That's hilarious. That's awesome. Yeah, that is a good question. For one, okay, so the one masculine value that we might think is around today is sort of this notion of honor, right? I think everyone has their own personal sense of honor, right? But we don't really live in an honor culture. There are, again, I'm not going to speak too much on this because there are historians that study honor culture by itself. But honor and honor cultures that existed during the War of 1812 typically only exist in pre-industrial societies where there is very little rule of law. So I think that's one thing that has changed. Everyone has their sort of personal sense of honor, but we don't necessarily live in an honor culture in the present day. At least I don't think so. But the other thing that I noticed a lot actually when doing research on this paper is that many conservative commentators sadly often peddle this myth of the overly emotional and irrational women versus the supposedly rational logical man. So that's actually something that I see, or it's a trope, or a stereotype I should say, that sort of continues into the present day, and it's one that's completely wrong and lacking all nuance.
Okay, great. And then I guess we have a final question. And on that note, I have one more question, but then if anyone else has any other questions, please put those in the chat and we can answer those after. If not, we will wrap things up. So final question, are there any other historical figures, from the War of 1812 or earlier that might benefit from a similar gender analysis of their life?
Yeah, I have thought about this before, and I think you could do a really good similar paper on James Wolfe, for sure, who's the famous British general that dies at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham during the 7 Years' War. So I think you could do a similar analysis of his life and the ways that he was remembered in Upper Canada, that would be really neat to do, or that would be really neat for someone to do from a gender history perspective. Because, you know, Wolfe is sort of like, he's similar to Brock in a lot of ways, and in the ways that he was remembered. So yeah, I think something similar could be done on Wolfe if something already hasn't been done. You could also do something similar on someone like George Washington, I think, but I don't know enough about the American literature to say that something hasn't already been done on him. And yeah, like Jesse says, Dunlop, William Tiger Dunlop would be a great one as well. He's a really interesting guy. And I think the last figure that I've thought of, I think you could kind of do a full-length study on how William Lyon Mackenzie was remembered as well, which is interesting because in this book here, actually, Public Men and Virtuous Women, Morgan sort of talks about how Mackenzie was sort of characterized in this unmanly way because he was seen as this like hothead that wasn't in control of his emotions, like the more conservative people that were members of the family compact, right? So Mackenzie was actually characterized by a lot of people as being sort of unmanly for being a supposed hothead. So I think someone could do a whole full-length study just on William Lyon Mackenzie and perceptions of him from a gendered angle. I think that'd be cool.
Okay, there's definitely some good options there. I think the Mackenzie one would be very interesting. It's very relevant. So
yeah, I think so
touch
too.
Points there.
Yeah.
Okay, so for those of you who missed the email, I reposted it in the chat. So please do email Jake if you guys have any other questions after the fact, or if you're interested in reading his paper. Next week, so like I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, this is the first of 3. Next week, Caitlin Carter will be giving her talk, same time, same place, same Zoom link, the myth of medical bravery, pain, masculinity, and nationalism in the War of 1812. So please, everyone, come and tune in for that. Once again, thank you so much for the talk, Jake. This was great. I learned a lot. As someone not from Niagara Falls, it was nice to hear about more local history, which is great. And thank you everyone for joining in, and have a lovely rest of your evening.
Thanks for having me. Thanks everyone.
Bye.